as well as Enfield and Granby, Connecticut, visit us on the web at westfieldbank.org.
Underwriting for Community Radio on WSKB is brought to you in part by Rockies. Over 30 convenient locations throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Florida. One of the nation's largest ACE dealers. Expertise and great product selection in paint, hardware, lawn and garden. That's Rockies. Rock solid service since 1926. On the web at rockies.com.
Listen to me, Michael Buster McMahon, Mondays 8 to 10 a.m. to learn the stories behind your favorite songs. Or don't. I'm not the boss of you.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
dick, that's a sex machine to all the chicks. You damn right. Who is the man that would risk his neck for his brother, man? Can you dig it? Who's the cat that won't cop out when there's danger all about? Right on. You see, this cat chef is a bad mother.
Shut your mouth.
What I'm talking about, Chef?
Then we can do it.
He's a complicated man, but no one understands him but his woman.
John Jack.
Good morning and welcome to Superintendent Spotlight. Mine is Zap and Chris this morning. It's producer Pete hosting a very interesting and a different Superintendent Spotlight. Today we want to talk about a topic. It's kind of in the news. It's been in the news for decades now, and we kind of want to relate it to how it affects people here in the United States. And we don't normally get to do that kind of a show on Superintendent Spotlight. We really promote the schools. But today we have a great guest, Dr. George Michael, and he is a counterterrorism and geopolitics professor at Westfield State University in the Criminal Justice Division. And we've had him on the show before in the Westfield News Show way back when. And I wanted to have him on again because originally the idea of the show was to talk about how Iran affects military families and things like that. But I think we really needed, it's kind of morphed into really a primer on Iran and how it's kind of been part of our country for years. So, Dr. Michael, thank you for coming down. It's been a while since you've been on the radio, and welcome into Superintendent Spotlight.
Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, and I just wanted to start, I'd like to give a little bit of background of where you come from so people know kind of your credentials. How did you end up, what did you start with, and how did you end up at Westfield State?
Okay, I grew up around outside the Philadelphia area. Way back when I was in the U.S. Air Force and the Pennsylvania Air National Guard. I did my undergraduate study at a place called Widener University in Chester, Pennsylvania. Originally, I was an economics major. I took some courses in political science, and I really enjoyed that. So for graduate school, I decided to pursue a master's degree, first a master's degree at Temple University, and then later a PhD in public policy at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. At the time, I was working for the U.S. Army as a civilian in the Washington, D.C. area. And so after I got my PhD, I decided I wanted to make a career change, so I entered academia. While I was working on my PhD, I read an awful lot about terrorism and political violence, political extremism, and so I decided to really concentrate that in the articles and books that I published. And
was that in like the 80s or 90s, kind of when terrorism was becoming on everybody's radar?
Yeah, well, there was a small clique of researchers in terrorism up until around the 1990s. Historically, the countries that have been interested in terrorism have been, for example, England because of its problems with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Yep. Israel has been bedeviled by terrorism, and so a lot of Israelis and Irish. There were some English and Israeli researchers on terrorism. In the United States, there was a small clique, but for obvious reasons, after 9/11, more and more researchers got involved.
Because terrorism never really touched our shores before 9/11, really.
Well, it was sporadic. There was domestic terrorism. Remember, in 1993, there was the first World Trade Center bombing.
Yep.
Later, it transpired that there was a foreign footprint. Ramzi Youssef, he was the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the architect of the 9/11 attacks. And, of course, there was sporadic domestic terrorism. Sometimes it was
the Murrah Federal Building.
Yeah, the Murrah P. Federal Building in 1995.
Yep.
Timothy McVeigh, of course, was the perpetrator for that. 168 people killed. So terrorism was something that affected America, but it was seen as very manageable, not anything that would be so horrific, not really an existential threat. That began really to change, though, in the 1990s. There was the first World Trade Center bombing,
where that became a premier target or a focus for terrorists.
Yes, it could
take
have
out
been,
the symbols.
Yeah, it could have been much worse. Yeah, the World Trade Center towers, of course, are symbolic of American economic might, American commerce, and so yes, it had a symbolic effect. And the attack could have been far more horrific if the people who carried it out had placed the truck bombs in a different place in the parking garage. Conceivably, one tower could have collapsed in the other, and if had that been the case, it would have been far more catastrophic than 9/11.
Now, educate people, because I know people hear terrorism, and the goal is to make you scared. But what is their political terrorism groups? What is their political goal by acts? Is it to try to take down another government? what's their ultimate goals?
Well, it could really vary. Some terrorist groups do endeavor to remove one government, replace it with something else. It can be for self-determination, where an ethnic group wants to be free from colonialism, establish its own sovereign nation.
Now, is that really Vietnam? Are you describing Vietnam?
Well, that would
to a certain extent?
That would be more in the realm of guerrilla warfare, but on occasion, the Viet Cong would carry out acts of terrorism in the cities like Saigon. So there's not always a sharp demarcation between terrorism and guerrilla warfare. The two can exist contemporaneously. For example, like the Algerian War in the late 1950s, there was guerrilla warfare in the countryside, but sporadic terrorism in the city as well.
All right, so back to the goals for terrorists. I interrupt you in the kind of the middle of them. Mm-hmm. One, you said about destabilizing governments, and then self-determination. Was there any other goals?
Yeah, there can be terrorist groups that champion a single issue. People, for example, that feel very strongly about the environment. People who are against abortion. They're against the Supreme Court's landmark Roe v. Wade decision from 1973, and they think that particular policy should be overturned and abortion should be criminalized again. So there can be single-issue terrorists, and then there can be cult-like terrorist groups as well, like Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, led by the late Shoko Asahara.
Did they do the subway stuff?
Yes, the subway attack at the Tokyo subway in 1995. And the idea behind what they wanted to precipitate was a global apocalypse out of which they believed they would build this new order. It's very hard to negotiate with a group like that.
They were trying to do using bioweapons, correct? And they wanted to spread it around the world.
Yeah, Aum Shinrikyo, some of its agents went to Africa to try to obtain the deadly Ebola virus and use biological warfare. They sent agents to Russia, some of whom even met with leading members of the Russian Defense Ministry to try to get weapons of mass destruction and perhaps ultimately nuclear weapons. Thankfully, they failed in that endeavor, though.
So in your classes at Westfield State, do your students feel better or worse about their view of the world after taking your classes?
Yeah, well, that's really a good question. And I'm not really sure. I never really noticed if they feel more.
Do you see a lot of blank stares going, "Oh my God, what's going on out there?"
It is hoped that after they take my class that they'll be more engaged, follow these issues in the news, and so I think the students become more intrigued by these issues and follow them more closely in the news. And I think that which you understand, I think you're more likely to be less fearful. Sometimes people should be fearful of certain things, but I think they come away with that, for the most part, terrorism is something that's, knock on wood, manageable in the West.
Manageable? Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's do a little history lesson on Iran, because I think everybody right now, they see the incident that happened, and that's kind of where we're going to end the hour, but I want to give them the history of this, because I think that the biggest thing is there's fear that all of a sudden that Iran's going to start a holy war in the U.S., which they've done for years. They've declared holy war in the U.S. 20, 30 years ago. I want to dispel a lot of the nervousness of the people of the United States about the situation with Iran and what their government is capable of. So let's start with a primer. I know you developed a whole bunch of slides. Mm-hmm. Why don't you give us a little bit of history of Iran? We'll talk about that in the first segment. And then we'll kind of transition to the 90s when we were at war in the Middle East, and then kind of the Cold War, almost a Cold War with the Islamic Republic of Iran that we have today.
Mm-hmm. Well, for years, decades, Iran was an integral part of America's Cold War alliance against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And for years, Iran was led by a monarch. Just some background information on...
If you look on your screen right now on Channel 15, you'll see that we have the background slide, and you can look on the big monitor over there.
Yeah, most of the people who reside in Iran are Shiite Muslims. Close to probably around 80-90% of the people who reside there are Shia Muslims. Iran composes about 1/3 of the world's Shiite population, the Ummah, or the Muslim community worldwide. As far as their ethnicities are concerned, a little bit over half of them are ethnic Persians. It's multi-ethnic. There are some Arabs, some Armenians, but historically, the country of Iran has been associated with ethnic Persians. Now, for years, Iran was led by a monarch. The first one was Reza Shah Pahlavi. The English had brought him to power in 1925. Around 1935, the Shah showed some signs that he might seek an alliance with Germany. Interestingly, in the year 1935, Pahlavi changed the name of his country from Persia to Iran, which basically translates into land of the Aryans. And so he was intrigued by this notion of Aryan mysticism, ancient Aryan origins of Persian civilization, things like that.
So that's something that I didn't even know, that he was trying to align himself with the Axis powers.
Yeah, but that was something, of course, for the Allied powers, England, Soviet Union, later the United States. They were averse to that. So in 1941, British troops entered the country, so did Soviet troops from the north, and as a consequence, the Shah was really forced to leave his throne, but the monarch remained in the family. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became the new monarch of Iran. After World War II, in 1953, there was a very important event. Pahlavi was forced to flee the country. There was a lot of political unrest in the country, and someone by the name of Mohammad Mosaddegh was elected to be the nation's new prime minister. And he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. That alarmed British authorities and American authorities. They thought that he was moving closer to the Soviet camp.
Well, is that also aligning themselves with what other countries in the Middle East were doing with their oil reserves, like the Saudis and things like that? They wanted to nationalize the oil business?
Yes, they wanted to nationalize the oil business.
Okay.
Now, Saudi Arabia has had a special relationship with America going back since World War II. Saudi Arabia never really indicated that it was going to nationalize their oil fields, but that's a
whole different topic.
Yeah, that was a different topic. Yeah, we could talk about that for a while. But but anyway, to make a long story short, the CIA orchestrated a coup against the new government formed by Mosaddegh. He was put under house arrest, and the Shah, the monarch, was reinstated as the monarch, the leader of the country. And so for a few decades, Iran really remained closly allied with the United States.
So at that time, we were doing that in a lot of places where we needed allies around the world.
Mm-hmm.
In the Cold War against Russia, basically, right?
Sure, yeah. We wanted to have the countries in the Middle East on our side. So much oil resides there, so it was strategically important for a number of reasons. Oil, and of course the United States over time developed a very close relationship with Israel, and so we wanted to have governments that were amenable to the Israelis, that they wouldn't
right,
cause
because
any aggression.
The biggest thing was that whole strip of land was taken from the Palestinians, and either they stayed and lived under Israeli rule, or they were exiled. And that was a goal of Arabic countries, is to take that land back.
Sure, that's a course of conflict which still persists to this day. It informs so much of the politics and so much of the conflict endemic to that region.
And for years it was a hot war between Egypt and Israel.
Yeah, they fought a number of times, 48, 67, and 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. Yes.
All right, so back to Iran, and now we have the Shah back in there, and basically he's being supported by the United States, but were his people really supportive of him?
No. He wanted to modernize his nation. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's really kind of emblematic of the Shah. He wanted to modernize his country, wanted to expand women's rights, workers, but his modernization efforts had the effect of essentially alienating virtually every segment of the population, the students, the young people.
So he wanted to make it a Western nation.
He wanted to essentially, yes, make it a modern Western nation. And of course, the most important element that he alienated was the clerics. And so he had a secret police, the Savak, which was notorious for torture and other human rights abuses. in the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter was the president, and he championed human rights abroad. And so he had no compunction about decrying human rights abuses, even those that were carried out by American allies, such as Iran. So more and more there was being pressure applied to the Shah to make reforms at home, but the more concessions that he made, that really just seemed to embolden the people who wanted to overthrow him.
So that's interesting, though, see, to me that seems a bit of a paradox, that he was trying to modernize the country, but yet he had a secret police, and that caused the human rights violations that alienated him to the United States. To me, that's like a paradox.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that as this went on, anti-Americanism began to increase in Iran as well, because the people in Iran essentially saw the Shah as propped up by the U.S. government. He was seen as kind of like a proxy for U.S. imperialism. And so more and more the people who wanted to overthrow the Shah had kind of an anti-American tenor to their rhetoric.
And that's where the seeds of what we have today were sown, right?
Yes. Specifically, 1979 was a very important year. Around that time, the Ayatollah Khomeini, a very well-respected cleric in Iran, made his way back to Iran. He was exiled, for about 15 years or so, first in Iraq, and eventually, interestingly, the government of Saddam Hussein pressured him to leave. He went to Paris in France, which in retrospect was a strategic mistake by his opponents, because while he was in France, he could avail himself of more sophisticated communications technologies. He was able to get his sermons by way of cassette tapes to the people in Iran, and more he fomented unrest, which culminated in the revolution in late 1978, 1979. It was a broad-based coalition, but in the main, the clerics led by the Ayatollah Khomeini were the main part of that coalition, which ultimately unseated the Shah.
So the Shia sect of Islam that's very conservative, right?
It can be, yes. You can have Sunni conservatives and Shiite conservatives. So it really depends from one culture to another. And for many years, Iran, we could say, was one of the more liberal Muslim nations with respect to things like women's rights, their attire. They didn't really have to cover their hair. They wore, on occasion, American type fashion skirts.
And that's what the Shah was. That's what the Shah was kind of emboldening in the culture.
Yes. Well, he wanted to return to a kind of more doctrinaire type of Islam.
Okay.
And
so in '78, that all came to a screeching halt.
Yes, reform as regards reform movements in Iran. Yes, that really came to a screeching halt. Essentially, the Ayatollah Khomeini created a theocracy, a government ruled by religious clerics. Moreover, he wanted to export the revolution throughout the region, and by doing so, that alarmed a lot of other leaders in the Muslim world. They were afraid of the religious radicals, that they could have a destabilizing effect in their nations as well.
Right, and so if people aren't unaware of the Islamic religion, the Ayatollah is a rank almost in the religion, right? That's a clerical position.
Yes, it's a clerical position, and to this,
not meaning typing. I mean like a cleric, meaning a religious person.
Sure, yeah, cleric and
religious leader.
Yeah, and not only that. The way the Iranian government is currently constituted, in this case, current Ayatollah Khamenei, he's considered the supreme leader. And so although there's a prime minister and a parliament, at the end of the day, he has a veto power over policies, and he can really influence policy to a great degree because of that position.
So at that time now, I remember this as a kid, the U.S. government had sanctions against Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And it led to really a breakdown in relations with Iran.
Well, before the implementation of sanctions, relations deteriorated between the two countries. Of course, the big thing that really had a transformative effect on American politics and its in America's relation to the Middle East was a hostage crisis. November 4th, 1979, there were student radicals in Iran. They jumped over the fence and seized hostages, U.S. hostages, at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And it's really hard to overstate the importance of this particular event.
I know it revolutionized news coverage in this country.
Yeah, it was actually
at the time. It really radically changed how things were covered, because I remember the show Nightline beginning, and it began as a day-to-day wrap-up of what was going on with news coverage that day in the hostage crisis, because it was such a big thing. At the time, it was the news story of the world.
Yeah, precisely. And Ted Koppel hosted that show for many years. And
Correct.
That's how it began. Yeah, and it's important the context of this hostage crisis when it occurred, 1979. 4 years before the North Vietnamese had taken over all of Vietnam. And so the way the American people saw it, there were a number of foreign policy setbacks. And so this was kind of like, you could say, the straw that broke the camel's back. It really occasioned a very angry response from the American people. They wanted something done very quickly. And it really kind of led to kind of a revival of patriotism in America that the American people hadn't witnessed really prior to Vietnam. Jimmy Carter, when he was president, he ordered a rescue mission. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. But
I want to put the slide back up for that one, because that was a big thing.
It failed miserably. April 24th, 1980, Special Forces were supposed to fly in by way of helicopter in Tehran and rescue the American hostages. A very bold idea, but it failed miserably. The helicopters, some of them crashed in the desert in Iran. For his part, then President Jimmy Carter took responsibility for that, but that essentially sealed his fate. He went on to lose the election in November of that year, and
literally that's what did him in. That one. Well, the failed rescue mission and his inability to negotiate. At that time, we still negotiated with terrorists, but his inability to negotiate and get the release of the hostages.
Yeah, he was seen as very ineffectual. And ultimately, the hostages were held for 444 days, 52 of them, and they were released the very same day that Ronald Reagan took his oath to become the new president of the United States.
I have a question for you on this.
Sure.
With the current news cycle, could something like that, would that drive a president out even earlier now, if something like that happened? I mean, try to put the context of those events into today.
Yes, I think especially if the people perceived the president as being impotent, that he couldn't get the job done, that nothing was really being done effectively to ameliorate the crisis, then, it could certainly have a backlash. Of course, President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, they took a lot of criticism over the deaths of U.S. embassy personnel in Libya back around 2011,
Yep.
It was. Yeah, it didn't result in the end of the Obama presidency. He ended up.
It did hurt his
reelected,
presidency a lot, though.
But it did damage his credibility with some people in America. But I think it could have the potential really to unseat a president again.
It really just is a different world now. Than covering some of this history. I remember how this was covered when I was a kid and into high school. It's amazing to me how different the landscape is now. And how rapid fire the landscape is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of it really can be, I think, traced back to this particular event in 1979. 1979 was the same year that the Soviet-Afghan War, right around Christmas 1979. And, of course...
which, if you want to put that into context, that was their Vietnam.
Yeah, that was seen as America's Vietnam. In fact, Jimmy Carter's one of his advisors, Brzezinski, he actually...
Leonid Brzezinski, yep.
Yeah, he actually wanted to... pay back the Soviets for supporting the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. The way he saw it, this would be a quagmire for the Soviets, and the CIA began at that point its largest covert operation ever to support the Mujahideen, the Arabs guerrillas who were fighting the Soviet Red Army.
And I recall that was the coming of age of Osama bin Laden.
Yes, Osama bin Laden.
He came out of that group.
Yeah, in 1980, he made his way to Pakistan to aid the Mujahideen in their effort against the Soviet Union. And so, yes, the genesis of Al Qaeda, the group responsible for the 9/11 attacks, had their genesis really in that particular conflict.
Isn't it funny how this is all related?
Yes, there's a lot of it is interrelated.
And you know that I'm watching the three students that are running camera here. They really don't have a lot to do, but they're listening, and I see looks on their faces going, "Wow, I can't believe what they're talking about right now," and how this is all So for these kids here, we're about halfway through the history. We're kind of up to the hostage crisis and moving into today. What should they, as students, be worried about in their day-to-day lives? Because I think that they get a lot of stress by whatever they see in the news or on their Facebook feeds or Twitter feeds. What should they be worried about?
Well, there's speculation that in retaliation for the assassination of Soleimani, that Iran could support terrorist groups around the world, and
which they already do.
Yeah, which strike American interest. I think that Iranian proxies would be unlikely to strike American interest at home in the United States for a number of reasons. For one thing, I think the Iranian government would not be so bold to do something like that. They would historically Iranian-sponsored terrorist groups have never struck U.S. interest in America. Now, they have struck Israeli and Jewish interest outside of the Middle East. Iranian-backed operatives were believed to have bombed the Israeli embassy around 1992, 1993, and also a Jewish center in Argentina. But usually, for the most part, Iranian-sponsored terrorist groups would target interest in the Middle East, not outside of the Middle East. And it's worth mentioning, for example, Hezbollah, the Lebanese-based terrorist group, which has its origins with the Iranian National Guards.
Which is almost directly run by General Soleimani, from what I'm gathering.
Yes. They have struck American interest on occasion. Most notably in 1983, they struck a Marine Corps barracks in Lebanon, which killed about 241 service members. In fact, prior to 9/11, Hezbollah was responsible for more terrorist fatalities against Americans than any terrorist group in the world. But
they're a long-standing group, too. They've been around for several decades, right?
Yes, the genesis of Hezbollah, which translates into Party of God.
But let's tease them on that, because let's take our first break, because
Okay.
I know that Hezbollah is coming up further
Sure.
on. You have a couple of slides on that I saw.
Mm-hmm.
Let's so right now we're at the hostage crisis is over, and we'll give the spoilers on that one in a minute. Be right back with Superintendent Spotlight on 89.5 FM WSKB and Channel 15 Westfield Community Programming.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children, watch that sound. Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop, hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and carrying signs. Mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. into your life it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop. Children, what's that sound?
Seems like yesterday, but it was long ago. Jane, it was lovely, she was the queen of my night. There in the darkness with the radio playing low and the secrets that we shared, mountains that we moved, caught like a wildfire out of control, till there was nothing left to burn and nothing left to prove. And I remember what she said to me, how she swore that it never would end. I remember how she held me, oh so tight. Wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. Against the wind, we were running against the wind. We were young and strong, we were running against the wind. And the years rolled slowly past, and I found myself alone, surrounded by strangers I thought were my friends. Found myself further and further from my home, and I guess I lost my way. There were oh so many roads. I was living to run and running to live, never worried about paying or even how much I owe. Moving 8 miles a minute for months at a time, breaking all of the rules that would bend. I began to find myself searching for shelter again and again. Against the wind, little something against the wind. I found myself seeking shelter against the wind. the wind. Against the wind. See the young man run. Against the wind. Watch the young man run. Against the wind. Watch the young man running. Against the wind. They'll be running against the wind. Against the wind. Let the cowboys ride. Against the wind. Against the wind. Let the cowboys ride. Against the wind. They'll be riding against the wind.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield. Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Dunkin' Donut Shops of Westfield and the Sardinia family. It's nice to know that even as the world changes, Dunkin' Coffee remains the same at 7 convenient locations throughout Westfield.
Want to get in the flow with Rob and Joe? Join host Joe Langoni and Rob O'Laurie Thursdays at 7:45 a.m. on Westfield Technical Academy's Tiger Talk.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield. Good morning and welcome back to Tiger Talk here on 89.5 FM WSKB. And Channel 15, Westfield Community Program Channel. It's 9:28 in the morning, and we're having actually a great discussion with Professor George Michael from Westfield State University. He is in the geopolitics realm and counterterrorism realm, and he's really a great guy to talk to about issues. And we wanted to focus on Iran this morning to really kind of bring people's fear down. I think that's the best word to use. People are scared because they only hear the snippets on the news, and they hear the pundits talking about it, and a lot of people are under the impression that this could lead to a World War III. Let's just talk about that real briefly, and then I want to get back to the presentation that you started and pick it up where Iran starts as a theocracy, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. So getting back to 1979, the cleric, the Ayatollah Khomeini, was in the forefront of the revolution in that year. But that event, the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini, the hostage crisis, really had some serious consequences. Arguably, Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980 in large part because Jimmy Carter was seen as weak and ineffectual with respect to the hostage crisis and the larger crisis with Iran and, of course, Afghanistan. And so Ronald Reagan became president. The American people became very angry by this hostage crisis, and it really led to a kind of a revival of patriotism in America. And Ronald Reagan began implementing a more muscular foreign policy that really continues to this day, and really, arguably, all of this was really set in motion in 1979. For his part, the Ayatollah Khomeini became a hero, not only among Shia Muslims in the Middle East, but some Sunni Muslims as well.
Because he stood up to the U.S.
He stood up to the United States, defied them, and he survived. And so that was very important.
Okay, so previous to that, then, if you stood up to the United States, you'd be quietly taken out.
That could happen on occasion. We talked about Mossadegh in 1953. He was ousted in a coup. He wasn't killed, but he was put under house arrest, and his political career was effectively over.
Okay. All right, so now we jump ahead, a couple of years? Or no, not even that long, a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in 1980? Now, the hostages, as I recall, were released the day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president.
Yes, that's correct. And I suppose there are two ways you can look at it. Some historians think that the Ayatollah Khomeini had an abiding dislike of Jimmy Carter, so he didn't want to release them until his presidency was over. Some people think that Ronald Reagan, he had this image of a cowboy, and that he might seek revenge against the Iranians if they didn't.
Does that remind you of the current president at all? See, people, I'm surprised with the reaction nowadays and how short people's memories are.
Mm-hmm.
people took Ronald Reagan to task in very similar tones as to how they're taking the current president to task.
Yes, the current president, yes. For example, when he was running for the presidency in 2016, on occasion he would be asked, how would you respond to ISIS? And he would just say, well, you don't want to know. And so, although he was vague on that, people could read between the lines, and it suggested that the gloves would come off and that he'd have no compunction about eradicating ISIS.
And as I recall, Reagan was the same way. He was very tough on Russia, and he was very outspoken about the hostage crisis.
Yes, he was. And remember Ronald Reagan, he really sent shockwaves around the world in 1983 when he ordered the invasion of the small island nation of Grenada. There was a communist government that had recently come to power there, but he unseated that government, and although it was a seemingly small operation, it had tremendous symbolic importance.
Yeah, that was like a clear message to the Russian government,
Yes.
saying we're not going to put up with this.
Yeah, that they
on our doorstep.
Yeah, they wouldn't put up with communist infiltration in Latin America. For example, Ronald Reagan supported the Contras, which they were fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which leaned toward the Soviets. And so, but not long after the hostage crisis, there was the Iran-Iraq war. This was very important. There was a lot of political turmoil in Iran at that time. The government was seen as kind of fragile, and the leader of Iraq at that time, Saddam Hussein, decided to take advantage of that situation, and he ordered his military to invade in September 1980. And that war was not unlike the First World War in the sense that it was largely a stalemate, for the most part kind of static. It wasn't really kind of like a blitzkrieg type war. It was more like World War I.
And that's when America switched sides, right? Because up until the installation of the Ayatollah Khomeini, we were supportive of Iran, and then in this we decided to pick sides in this because Iran started leaning towards the Soviet side. We picked Iraq.
Yeah, it was based on this kind of enemy of my enemy notion. Iraq was fighting Iran, which overnight had become vehemently anti-American, and so by way of covert operations, covert support, the United States supported the Iraqi government in the conflict against Iran. It was a very ruinous war for both sides. It's hard to come up with precise figures, but it's estimated that all totaled 500,000 soldiers killed on both sides of the conflict. Roughly 100,000 civilians died. And this episode in history really reinforced in Iran that it faced hostile nations on its borders, from Arabs and Sunni Muslims. Because remember, Iran, most of the people who reside there are not Arabs. Most of them are Persians, along with other ethnic groups. There is an Arab minority, and also they overwhelmingly belong to the Shiite denomination of Islam, so that makes them a minority. They're surrounded by Sunni Muslim powers.
And I didn't realize how long that war actually went. It went for 8 years.
Yeah, 8 years. And so it was very ruinous for both sides. It was essentially a stalemate. Some people think that Iran won the war, but for the most part it was a stalemate. Eventually there was a UN-brokered ceasefire, and the war finally ended. But nevertheless, it kind of reinforced this notion in Iran, in their minds, their collective minds, that they faced serious adversaries, primarily from Sunni Muslims and Arabs. And so historically, Iran has been more concerned about its Arab neighbors than it has been with Israel.
That's something that you said early on, and that kind of surprised me, that they've always projected an image of, we're taking on the world and the United States specifically.
Yes.
But yet privately and by their actions, you said they're more worried about what's the barbarians at the gate.
That's correct, yeah. And they use a lot of this bombastic rhetoric, anti-American rhetoric, anti-Israeli rhetoric to kind of demonstrate to their Muslim and Arab neighbors, hey, look, we're more Muslim than you are. We champion the Palestinians in their struggle against Israel. Back around 2005, 2006, the person who was president of Iran at that time, a fellow by the name of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he even went so far as to say that the Holocaust was a hoax, that it was greatly exaggerated, and of course that unsettled a lot of people,
Sure.
the Israelis and Jews in the diaspora and other parts of the world as well. But a lot of that was strategically calculated to really try to increase his authenticity with other leaders in that region, with his Arab and Sunni Muslim neighbors.
For the people who are listening, I just want to reset everything. My name is Peter Coles, filling in for Superintendent Spotlight today. And we have Dr. George Michael from Westfield State University, who is an expert on geopolitics and counterterrorism. And we're talking about Iran and just kind of dispelling the myths, rumors, innuendos, with just the plain facts of how we get to where we were just a couple of weeks ago. And we're kind of into the point now where they become the almost leader in state-sponsored terrorism.
Yes, Iran has been implicated in sponsoring terrorist groups around the world. Palestinian groups like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, but the most important group that it really fostered is the group Hezbollah in Lebanon. Just to recapitulate what I said earlier, Hezbollah stands for Party of God, and it really began, its origins could be traced back to 1982. And that year, the Israeli Defense Forces invaded Lebanon, and so eventually a number of Shiite clerics, they crystallized together and created an alliance with the help of Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Iran's Revolutionary Guards, they're kind of like the special forces for
they're
Iran.
the elite forces.
Yeah, and they've been involved in organizing Hezbollah and other groups that promote the Iranian agenda in the Middle East.
And at that time, too, Lebanon was basically a country in name only. They really didn't have much of a government at that time, and it was kind of a free-for-all. When did the barracks bombing happen in Lebanon? Was that 82?
1983, October 23rd, 1983. At the time, Ronald Reagan thought it would be a good idea to send a contingent of members of the Marine Corps there to stabilize the situation. Things were going from bad to worse in Lebanon. There was a civil war which commenced in 1975. Lebanon is multi-ethnic, multi-denominational, and it really just came apart in the mid-1970s.
Right.
At one time, believe it or not, it was seen as the jewel of the Middle East, kind of a model for interdenominational cooperation, but that broke down in 1975.
Right, that was like the vacation spot, really. That was in the 60s and early 70s. That was where everybody went to holiday.
Yeah, it was once a colony of France, and so there was a French culture, too, a Francophone culture which persisted. I've seen as a very cosmopolitan place, very modern Middle Eastern nation. That would be, yes, nice to go on vacation there.
And even to this day, that country is very fragmented.
Yeah, it's very fragmented. Hezbollah, the group, is kind of a state within the state, exerts tremendous influence not only in Lebanon but in the region. And so Hezbollah, yes, they were...
Let's get that graphic back up.
Yeah, they were believed to be responsible for the truck bomb on October 23rd, 1983. I mentioned that in the next slide.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, if you want to...
There we go.
Yeah, and so this was very important because this was, for many years, the most lethal attack against American interests. That same day, Hezbollah struck a French base, killing 58 French soldiers. Ronald Reagan was very upset by this particular incident. People who knew him said that he fell into a deep depression as a result of this. He felt personally responsible.
Yeah, he felt responsible. I remember him coming out in his speech saying, this one is basically, it was a long speech, but he came out and said, this one's on me.
Yes, he did.
That this is my fault.
He took full responsibility, and ultimately he decided to withdraw the Marine Corps from that region and hand that job over to the United Nations. But it's interesting because this particular episode demonstrated that on occasion terrorist acts can have the desired effect. In this particular case, Hezbollah wanted to drive Americans out of Lebanon, and so in that sense, this particular attack had the desired effect.
Yeah, so in that, right now, like you said, Hezbollah really runs the southern end of Lebanon.
That's correct. They have tremendous influence. Nasrallah, their leader, he has tremendous moral authority in not only in Lebanon, but throughout the Middle East, including with Sunni Muslims, because he's seen as someone who has stood up to Israel on a number of occasions and has survived.
Right, and it's kind of like a stalemate with Israel and Hezbollah. They tolerate them on their border, but they're also not going to let them get any inroads into Israel or into the West Bank.
Yes, they want to prevent the Hezbollah from spreading their influence, and on occasion, Hezbollah has been behind rocket attacks on Israel.
Yeah, lobbing a couple shots over the border to see if they can provoke something.
Yes, and Hezbollah is probably the best organized terrorist group in the world, if you want to characterize it as a terrorist group. Now,
I consider more of a government at this point.
Yeah, some people would take issue with that characterization. Says, well, Hezbollah does a lot more than terrorism. They provide social services to the people, and so
they're a government.
Yeah,
really.
Effectively a government. Yes, a state within a state, and terrorism is just something that they were involved in the past, but now they've evolved into what a lot of people see as a legitimate de facto government.
So, do you think they'll ever get recognized as a state by the to kind of mute their activities in other places? Their kind of conquest activities?
Well, I don't see
Would that be a good political move?
Yeah, I don't see it on the horizon right away, but I think they have this kind of de facto state status that they'll maintain. They even have a media arm, their own television station, but I don't really see them taking over the government of Lebanon at this particular time.
Does the United States have diplomatic relations with Hezbollah?
I don't think they have official relations with Hezbollah. That said, they can avail themselves to back-channel sources, sometimes, for example, to go through Pakistani officials to reach out to the Iranians, because since 1979, the U.S. has not maintained official ties with Iran.
Right. So let's, it's about quarter of. Do you want to take one more break? And then you know what? Let's just go right to the top of the hour. Let's get to the gentleman at hand and his rise to fame, because that started really right around this time. He really started to rise to prominence.
Yeah, Qasem Soleimani. He was born in 1957, and he joined the Revolutionary Guards in 1979. When he was about 21 years old, he has very humble beginnings. He worked in construction, came from a poor family, quit school at an early age so he could go to work and support his family. He's often been characterized as the strategic mastermind who works behind the scenes. He was an Iranian patriot, took his positions very seriously, had a very distinguished war record in the Iran-Iraq War. He led the 41st Division, and in the late 1990s, he took over leadership of Al-Quds. Al-Quds is essentially Iran's special forces and intelligence agency. It operates often outside of Iran and foreign countries. And so Soleimani was involved in a number of operations that were very important. For example, during the Second Gulf War, he reached out to insurgents that were fighting the coalition forces. First the Shiite rebels, but then later he began supplying improvised explosive devices to some of the Sunni rebels that were fighting the coalition forces. And that was very, very important, very deadly. I've read recently that perhaps 20% of all U.S. fatalities in that war can be traced back to Iranian-supplied IEDs. These were very sophisticated IEDs. At first, the improvised explosive devices were made by hand by the Iraqi insurgents, but the Iranian government supplied very sophisticated IEDs, which could do tremendous damage.
Isn't it interesting that Iran has become that power that they despised of the U.S. as supporting groups to, undermine other countries? That's what they despise about the U.S. is, hey, you stuck a Shah in our country and you propped him up, and now they're doing the same thing. Does that strike you as
propping up the government in Iraq?
propping up now the government, but then the insurgents in Iraq, which after we set up a democratic rule, a lot of those insurgents and insurgent leaders got elected.
Yes, yeah, and the rise of Iranian influence in Iraq can be traced back to the American intervention in that war, because one of the stated goals of Operation Iraqi Freedom was to depose Saddam Hussein,
which was accomplished.
Yes, and introduce democracy. But in that part of the world, oftentimes elections are like an ethnic referendum, and so in the case with Iraq, 60% of its population consists of Shiite Muslim Arabs.
Yep.
And so in a situation like that, they have kind of a majority. They control the government just because of sheer numbers.
Right.
Sunnis compose about 20% of the population, Sunni Arab Muslims, and Kurds compose around 18%.
Right.
So a clear majority, the Shiites have a clear majority, and in that region of the world, elections is, just as I mentioned before, is often ethnic referenda,
Well,
and
one
so
thing
majority rules.
One thing I heard that wasn't reported, I know that was reported that the Iraqi government took a vote to throw out the U.S. troops, but what wasn't reported is that I believe it was the Sunni members of parliament didn't even show up for the vote because they were protesting it.
Yes, that's right. The Sunnis, back during the time of the rule of Saddam Hussein, it was they who really controlled the government, the leading positions.
The minority.
Yeah, and they were a minority, and a lot of that can be traced back to British imperialism. They essentially propped up the Sunnis to run the government, and that persisted for many years. And that system did not finally end until the demise of Saddam Hussein. And so it's natural that Iranian influence would increase in Iraq now, in as much as there's a government led by
a friendly government in the Shiites.
In the Shiites, Shiite
right.
majority-led government. And so it's understandable that they would reach out to Iran more and see them as a natural ally in the Middle East. But by doing so, all these trends have alienated Sunni Muslims in Iraq, and so
right, and that vote was along party lines, as it were. We recognize that in the U.S. of voting along party lines solely, and that the Sunnis weren't even present in Parliament when that vote was taken.
Yeah, well, the Sunnis,
and that's why it wasn't a hard and fast; it was a referendum.
Yeah, the Sunnis have this ambivalent attitude toward the Americans. They see, for example, America deposed Saddam Hussein and essentially led to
take them out of power.
Yeah, the reduction of Sunni power in Iraq. But on the other hand, coalition forces can provide some stability and safety for the Sunni minority, which on occasion has been oppressed by the new the Shia-led government. Shia, for example, militia groups have committed atrocities against Sunni Muslims. It's been back and forth on both sides, but inasmuch as the Sunnis are now the minority, some of them think it might be a good idea to have somewhat of an American footprint that remains, just to protect them in the event that political violence should once again increase like it did in the mid-2000s.
All right, let's get back to Soleimani's resume. I want to put that graphic back up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he led the Quds Force. He was involved in a number of things. The Second Gulf War. He's believed to have orchestrated a number of political assassinations, one of the more notorious of which occurred in 2005. The Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, was assassinated in 2005. Soleimani assisted Hezbollah in its confrontations with Israel. And Soleimani assisted President Bashar al-Assad in Syria in the Syrian civil war against rebel groups, including ISIS. It's worth mentioning that on occasion, the national interest of the United States and Iran have been in alignment. For example, after 9/11, the Iranians actually assisted the Americans in their struggle against the Taliban, because the Taliban had been oppressing a Shiite minority that resides in Afghanistan. So on occasion, the two sides, their interests align.
So they're not completely against America. When we'll be your friend when we need to be your friend.
Yeah, there have been efforts to forge a rapprochement, the relaxation of tensions between the two nations, but unfortunately those efforts have faltered.
And is that the reason? We're going to get to this in a second, but seems like Soleimani was a frequent visitor in Iraq.
Yes, he was.
Because of supporting the Shiites
and
the government.
Yeah, and also the Iranians would prefer that America leave the country, and so they had a vested interest in helping those groups that would help expel American influence out of the country.
Could it be said that he was kind of the shadow leadership in Iraq?
Yes, that's a good way to characterize him. He was kind of the man behind the throne, as it were. Yes, he exerted quite a bit of influence. He eschewed the limelight, but instead he pretty much exerted his influence behind the scenes, and that's not uncommon for people who work in intelligence.
Why was he so well? Yeah, we saw that with George Bush Sr.
Mm-hmm.
That
former
he was
director of the CIA,
right? Why was he so popular? Soleimani so popular in the Islamic world?
Well, I think he was popular because he was successful. And oftentimes he stood up to America, supporting Hezbollah, supporting the insurgency in Iraq. So he was seen as often standing up to America. Not only that, he was seen as very effective.
Okay.
What he had done, he survived, and he was just seen as a very important strategic operative in that particular region of the world.
All right, now let's get to what started right after the first of the year this year.
Mm-hmm.
And us kind of doing what we do. I mean, Obama had an opportunity to take out Osama bin Laden, and he authorized that. Trump had the ability to take out Soleimani, who he considered an imminent threat. That's what he said. And so reading the history of Soleimani, I would agree with him. I just don't think they delivered the message very well. But so let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, Iranian operatives were believed to have been behind in fomenting a lot of unrest in Iraq. And for obvious reasons, the Trump administration did not want that. This has been a big headache. Iraq, Donald Trump, when he was running for the presidency, wanted to extricate America from a lot of these quagmires in the Middle East.
Right, he wanted to stabilize the country.
He wanted to stabilize the country. It's the old China shop dictum. What is it? If you break it, you pay for it.
Break it, you own it.
Yeah, you own it. And so in this particular case, the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. It became really a basket case. So America could not really just walk away from it and maintain its international prestige. It was
because that's what we've done in the past.
Yeah.
And it's become a quagmire.
Yeah, it was incumbent upon America to fix it. And so for that reason, Donald Trump didn't want Iranian operatives destabilizing the country. He didn't like that. And so he thought that Soleimani was really the mastermind behind a lot of this mischief that has been going on in Iraq and other countries in the Middle East, and one way to stop it would be to assassinate him. And of course, drone technology has become more sophisticated. There are intelligence operatives on the ground, and so using all those resources, Donald Trump was able to use a very surgical application of violence and assassinate Soleimani without any collateral damage, at least that I know of. That is to say, only the.
I think they took out his helicopter or his plane or something. Right?
Yeah. He had recently landed at the airplane, I believe, and came off an airplane, and he was entering an automobile.
So, what does this mean for geopolitics? I mean, does this hamper? Does this set back Iran in any way, or do they have somebody next man up can do what he could do?
Yeah, well, I think they have a next man up. It's not really known who's going to fill that position now, but I think there's another person that could be really cultivated to fill his shoes, but they'll be really big shoes to fill because he did have a very important track record. He was seen as a strategic mastermind, so they'll be tough shoes to fill. But historically, the Iranians come off as very shrewd negotiators, shrewd operators, and so I think, yes, they'll find someone to replace him.
And I know they said that they're going to have a response, but do you think that the measured response against the U.S. bases was just that, a measured response, and that's all we're going to hear out of them?
Well, that's their official position. they still have tremendous potential to create a lot of mischief in the region. Of course, American bases are.
Are they linked to the attack in Yemen at all?
I don't know. I'm not
Okay.
sure if they were linked to that. But they could still, of course, undermine American efforts in Afghanistan.
Yep.
They have the potential to do that. They can still cause problems in Syria against American interest, cause damage to American interest in Iraq. So they have the potential through their operatives to still reach out and do damage to America. But also, I think. As far as the Iranian population is concerned, I think a lot of the people there, especially the young people, are very weary. They're weary of a lot of this kind of conflictive policy that the Iranian government has pursued vis-a-vis America for the past 4 decades. A lot of them would prefer a normalization of relations between the two countries.
Did we see that really graphically illustrated? I saw a video clip of them protesting the downing of the Ukrainian jetliner, where they literally, there was an American and an Israeli flag painted on the street, and I'm not sure where it was in Tehran, but they walked around it and refused to stomp on it for the first time ever in a protest that I've seen.
Yeah, there have been overtures like that we've seen where the Iranians demonstrated that they want to improve relations with America. In the late 1990s, there was a wrestling match, not WWE, but as they say, real wrestling, an American wrestler.
Greco-Roman,
something to that effect in the late 1990s. And one of the top American wrestlers went over there, and he defeated his Iranian opponent. And the response that the American wrestler got in Iran was very heartfelt. They cheered him, despite the fact that he was American. In fact, that was one of the reasons why they cheered him so strongly, because they liked the idea that perhaps there could be a normalization of relations between the two countries. So some people in Iran would like to once again reach out to America, but there's still hardliners that remain among the clerics.
Yeah, that was my
and
next
top
question.
leadership.
Is that ever going to happen?
It's hard to say. Some people think that the regime is brittle, that it's on the cusp of collapse, but I think history has demonstrated that regime has demonstrated staying power. So I'm very skeptical when I hear reports that it's on the brink of collapse.
And with about a minute to go, were you surprised that they took responsibility for downing that Ukrainian jetliner?
Not really. After all, this is the internet age, and with things like that, it's harder to keep secrets in today than in the past. There's much greater transparency, and so I think for that reason, Iran was pretty much compelled to acknowledge it in order to maintain credibility, because I think eventually the truth probably would have leaked out one way or the other.
And finally, one last thing. Should Americans be on high alert, or should they just be cautious in their everyday lives, thinking that there could be a terror attack on the United States?
I don't expect any retaliatory terrorist attacks in America as a result of this most recent crisis. However, overseas, American soldiers who are stationed in places in the Middle East, there is potential for the Iranians to cause trouble and potentially hurt American soldiers.
Dr. George Michael, I'd love to thank you. Our hour and 15 minutes kind of flew by this morning. I'd like to thank you for giving us the history lesson and kind of a master class on Iran, and dispelling some of the fears by getting the facts out there of where we stand, where our relations are, and the fact that, you know, on occasion we can agree on things with a country like Iran, which we just see as an iconic evil empire in the Arab states. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. I enjoyed it.
It was eye-opening for the students in here running cameras for you. They were intently listening the entire time, and they learned a lot as well. So thank you very much for coming on Superintendent Spotlight.
Okay, thanks, Pete. It's good talking to you again.
All right. That's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow with JP's Talk About Town at 6 a.m.